Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples, the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 120, The Stand on the Ugra. Ivan III had become Grand Knyaz without either seeking or receiving the approval of any Khan. He did not ask any Khan's permission before conducting his foreign policies, or, for example, before annexing Novgorod. Tribute was no longer paid as a matter of course. Moscow was becoming independent, but it had not yet declared itself independent, and that independence had not been recognized by the Tatars or its neighbors. The path to independence was a process, not something that happened all at once with a sudden national uprising. Moscow had complex relations with the Tatars, which only got more complex as the Horde's successor states emerged. These successors, and Moscow, also had complex relations with Lithuania, and all of these constantly affected how they dealt with each other. We've already seen how Ivan III dealt with the new Khanate of Kazan at the beginning of his reign, but there were two other forces that he needed to deal with on his southern flank. Khan Ahmed of the Great Horde, who still formally claimed that Moscow was his vassal, and the Khanate of Crimea. The Great Horde was an immediate military threat that Ivan would need to tackle. The Khanate of Crimea shared a border with the southern parts of the Lithuanian territory, now Ukraine, and it was vital for Ivan that they did not make an alliance together against him. The first incident came a few years into Ivan's reign, in 1465. Ahmed assembled an army on the Don, intending to raid Russian territory. Before they could start their campaign, they were attacked and defeated by the Crimean Tatars, led by Khan Haji Girey, founder of the Girey dynasty. This began a war between the two hordes, and their hostility would be the basis of Moscow's policy in the south. In 1470, Kazimierz of Lithuania, perhaps because of his contacts in Novgorod, sent an envoy to the Great Horde, encouraging Ahmed to attack Moscow. His ambassador, Girey, was a Tatar who had previously worked for Ivan III before defecting to Lithuania. He brought a proposal that Ahmed and Kazimierz coordinate a joint attack on Moscow. Some of Ahmed's nobles, who had formerly collected tribute from the Russians, spoke out in favor of the plan, but Ahmed was apparently reluctant. Perhaps he was worried about the Crimeans. He told Girey that he would have to stay in the camp until he could think of a suitable gift to send back to Kazimierz, and the ambassador's stay dragged on for over a year. In the summer of 1471, however, one of Ivan's raiding/reconnaissance missions from Vyatka got as far as Sarai. Finding it barely guarded, since Ahmed and the main camp were a day's ride away, they sacked it, loaded their boats with plunder, and set off home. As soon as he received word, Ahmed dispatched a force in pursuit, but they were unsuccessful. Girey was quickly sent back to Kazimierz with agreement for a joint campaign. However, Ahmed had missed his window. Kazimierz had already got involved in a war with Hungary and could not spare anyone to fight Moscow. After another year, Ahmed decided to invade on his own. Once again he had missed his window. If he had gone ahead the previous year, Ivan would have been busy in Novgorod. Now he had his forces back on the southern border, and the Tatars were spotted before they reached the Orka. It's quite likely that Kazimierz had been encouraging Ahmed again. There's a reference in the Chronicles saying that he attacked Russia at the urging of the king, and he took a route close to the Lithuanian border rather than the traditional approach through Kolomna and Serpukhov. This threw Ivan off a bit. When word of the Tatar movements arrived in Moscow, it was unclear what the target was supposed to be. Ivan therefore called on everyone, his brothers, Vasily of Verea, the Tatar Tsarevichi, and his leading boyar generals. The chronicle claims the army reached 180,000 troops, certainly an exaggeration, but indicating that it was a general mobilization, and Ivan distributed them along the southern border. Nevertheless, the attack at Alexin on the east bank of the Orka took them by surprise, and the town was burned. But the Russians reacted quickly. By the time Ahmed had got his forces across the river, it was clear to him that the opposing army was much larger than his, and he decided to withdraw. Still, the attack was taken as a demonstration that the risk of an alliance between Lithuania and the Great Horde was a genuine threat. As a result, Ivan stepped up diplomatic relations with the Crimean Khanate, looking to form an alliance, while still also approaching Ahmed to agree a non-aggression pact. The Crimean Khanate was now led by Menli Giray, the second son of Haji Giray, often regarded as the father of Crimean Tatar statehood. Ivan opened negotiations with him soon after Ahmed's attack, using a Jewish merchant from Kaffa, Hoja Kokos, as his intermediary. Progress was slow. It had taken Menli 12 years of conflict with his brother Nur Devlet to secure the Khanate, and his main concern was his own security. Ivan wanted their agreement to designate Kazimierz as their common enemy, which Menli was cautious about, while Menli wanted to designate Ahmed as the same, and Ivan was equally cautious. In parallel, Ivan opened talks with Ahmed over neutrality, which resulted in a major Tatar delegation visiting Moscow in the summer of 1474. Meanwhile, a Gian Battista Trevisan was being held prisoner in Moscow. Trevisan was an ambassador from the Doge of Venice who had been sent to Moscow to make contact with the Tatars about joining the anti-Turkish league that Venice was trying to put together. Due to a misunderstanding, he had been taken for a spy and was only saved from execution by the intervention of the papal legate. Ivan had recently received confirmation from Venice that Trevisan's mission was indeed to try to bring the Tatars into a war against the common enemies of Christendom, and he approved. If the Horde was fighting the Turks, they'd have no time to get involved in any war between Lithuania and Russia. So, when the Tatar mission returned to Sarai, it took Trevisan and Ivan's man, Dmitry Lazarev, with it. A few months previously, Ivan had sent his first official ambassador to Crimea, Nikita Beklemishev. The Bek in the name might make you wonder if this was a Tatar convert, but this noble Muscovite family was actually of Armenian origin. Beklemishev was given clear instructions from Ivan. He was to insist on Ivan's right to continue diplomatic relations with the Horde and endeavour to keep Ahmed's name off the list of mutual enemies. Ahmed was only to be included if Menli agreed to include Kashmir's, and agreement was not otherwise possible. However, Menli still refused to designate Kashmir's as an enemy. The following year, a new envoy, Alexei Starkov, was sent with a new proposal. If Menli agreed not to aid Kashmir's in the event of a war between Moscow and Lithuania, then Ivan was willing to ally with Crimea against the Great Horde. Starkov's mission failed for reasons well outside of his control. In 1475, the Ottomans had invaded Crimea and taken Kaffa. By the end of the year, they controlled the entire southern shore of Crimea. The peninsula had been officially declared an Ottoman province, and a Turkish garrison deployed. Menli Giray was imprisoned for several months, and then allowed out as a Turkish vassal. Meanwhile, Ahmed was more impressed by what the Turks offered than the Venetians, and had formed an alliance with them. He sent his son to invade Crimea and overthrow Menli. The Turks were willing to cooperate with either side, without going out of their way to provide any support. Menli was overthrown and spent several years in a Turkish prison. Jani Bek, one of Ahmed's men, ruled in Crimea. This situation lasted until 1479, when Menli was released and recovered his throne. We don't have any records explaining how or why this happened. Menli returned to his throne in different circumstances to 5 years earlier. He knew he could not rely on the Turks, so he needed an ally. Kashmir's had never offered him anything, but was a friend of Ahmed. 2 of his brothers were living in Lithuania, and they were another source of potential trouble. Meanwhile, Ivan had officially notified Ahmed that Moscow would not be paying tribute anymore, and had terminated diplomatic relations with the Great Horde. Everything made Menli's choice of ally obvious. Menli wrote to Ivan, informing him that he was willing to conclude an alliance on the terms that had been under discussion 4 years earlier. New ambassadors were sent. Ivan went out of his way to impress Menli. He persuaded Menli's brothers to move from Lithuanian-controlled Kiev to Moscow, where he could supervise them. Menli was grateful. By spring 1480, the final version of the treaty was ready. It provided for a defensive alliance against Ahmed. If one was attacked, the other would provide assistance, and an offensive alliance against Kashmir's. If one decided to attack Lithuania, the other would join. This suited Ivan exactly. He had no intention of attacking Ahmed, because why would he want to rule nomad pastures? But it was likely that Ahmed would attack Moscow. On the other hand, he did have plans for various territories currently controlled by Lithuania. "1480 turned out to be a year full of action. Casimir's conspired with factions in Novgorod to encourage a revolt, which we'll deal with in another episode. He may have been responsible for bringing in the Livonian Brotherhood, but in any case they started raiding across the Russian border, and it soon became clear that they had ambitions of conquering Pskov. Boris and Andrei the Elder had started a rebellion, dissatisfied with Ivan's centralization of power and wealth, rather than the old ways of generous appanages for the immediate family, the Grand Knyaz. The pair get a pasting in the chronicles, which describe the general reaction to their demands as public terror and alarm. They had poor control over their soldiers, who pillaged widely. Ivan sent Archbishop Vasyan and two of his highest-ranking boyars to make a pretty generous offer to his brothers that if they returned to their patrimonial bases, he would grant them their demands. The brothers rejected the offer because they wanted to see what they could extract from Kasimir's. But when Kasimir's envoy arrived, it turned out that he did not want to get involved. If he had indeed been one of the instigators of the rebellion, when it happened, did not fit his schedule. The brothers tucked their tail between their legs and headed back to Ivan. This time, despite their mother's intervention, Ivan was far less accommodating. He knew Casimir's had turned them down. He had concluded his treaty with mainly Giray, and he knew that Ahmed was not mobilizing. He decided that if he refused to treat with them, they would be forced to give up and go home with nothing. So the rebels sat around on Andrei the Elder's territory, near the border with Lithuania, for the whole of the summer. The situation changed in August when a large Livonian army attacked Izborsk. Quickly realizing the fortress was too strong to take easily, they marched on Pskov and placed the city under siege. Pskov sent appeals to Novgorod and Moscow, but also to the rebel brothers, who were nearer. Before any help could arrive, the Livonians lifted the siege and departed. The people of Pskov celebrated their miraculous release. A week later, Andrei and Boris arrived. They demanded that Pskov provide accommodation to their families. The city, no longer being under immediate threat, was concerned that this would make them look like they were supporting Ivan's enemies. So they sent back a refusal, quoting the Bible about it not being possible to serve two masters. The rebel brothers reacted by letting their army off the leash. As the chronicle puts it, quote, "They laid waste to many districts like infidels. They plundered the houses of God and killed much cattle. They defiled women and led them off into captivity. They did not even leave a chicken alive." End quote. Pskov scraped together some money to pay them off, and the brothers moved back to Novgorod territory, continuing to terrorize the locals until the bishops persuaded Ivan to forgive them. The army was dispersed, and they returned home. As summer drew to a close, the Great Horde began to move north, in what all the evidence suggests was intended to be a large-scale invasion of Russia. The immediate trigger had been Ivan's official refusal to pay further tribute, but the decisive factor had been cooperation with Casimir's. Ahmed's ambassadors discussed the campaign with the Lithuanians, and the Tatars rode north under the assumption that the Polish-Lithuanian army would be moving from the west at the same time. There is even a source suggesting that the rebel brothers were in on it and had been supplying intel to Ahmed and Kazimierz. However, just as Mamai found himself caught short when Jogaila failed to arrive on time, the Khan would be on his own. The brothers' rebellion had come to nothing, and Kazimierz did not set out at all. Tatar scouts were spotted at the Oka in June. Ivan once again acted quickly to strengthen the southern front. He sent Andrei the Younger to Tarusa and his son and heir apparent, the 22-year-old Ivan Ivanovich, to Serpukhov, while he himself moved his headquarters to Kolomna. Ahmed was not in any hurry. He moved cautiously, waiting to receive word that Kazimierz was approaching. When his scouts detected the Russian movements, he decided to swing west into Lithuanian territory, cross the Oka there, and then cross the Ugra to outflank the Russians. Ivan countered this maneuver by sending Andrei the Younger and Ivan Ivanovich to Kaluga, near the confluence of the Oka and Ugra. They set up guards at the fords. Ivan's problem with the long frontier was that once the frosts arrived at the end of autumn and the rivers started to freeze, the Tatars would be able to cross wherever they chose. Covering the whole front meant more troops, and that meant letting Andrei the Elder and Boris back into the fold. Ivan returned to Moscow at the end of September to deal with the brothers and the capital's defences. In the space of 3 days, he called a council of state with the senior clergy, his mother, Mikhail of Vereya, and all the boyars. The council decided that, whatever it took, the Tatars must be defeated. Then his brothers were summoned, forgiven, and given what they had been asking for. Finally, Ivan handed the city's defense to the command of Knyaz Ivan Patrikhev, attended church to pray for victory, and then set off back to the army. This time he set up his headquarters at Kremenets on the Luja, around 50 kilometers away from the Ugra, a better position than Kaluga if Kazimierz decided to join. All available troops were sent to the Ugra. Boris and Andrei the Elder's armies were to form the reserve when they arrived. On October the 8th, Ahmed and his army arrived at the confluence of the Oka and Ugra. Although there was no sign of Kazimierz, he decided to cross at once. However, Ivan Ivanovich and Andrei the Younger put up a solid defense. Using bows, arquebuses, and field guns, they held the crossing for 4 days. On October 12th, Ahmed withdrew to the nearby town of Vorotinsk to wait for the river to freeze. In the meantime, he dispatched his men to pillage the surrounding countryside. The chronicle says that he scattered them throughout the Lithuanian land. This seems a bit surprising, but the list of towns attacked shows that there was a clear plan to hit those who had dubious loyalty to Kazimierz and were suspected of planning to defect to Moscow. It seems clear that Ahmed was still waiting for the Lithuanians to join him. Meanwhile, Ivan sent messengers to try to persuade Ahmed to leave. Ahmed demanded that Ivan or one of his sons come to negotiate themselves. Ivan has come in for strong criticism here, being accused of excessive caution and even cowardice. His personal priest, Archbishop Vassian, took it that way. In a public speech, he begged the Grand Knyaz to ignore advisors counseling peace and defend the Christian faith against the pagans. Historians tend to believe that Ivan was simply playing for time. On 20th of October, Andrei the Elder and Boris arrived at Kremenets with their armies. According to the chronicle, what happened next was that Ivan withdrew his forces to Kremenets and then back even further to Barovsk. The chroniclers say that he was afraid of the Tatars and had been listening to evil counselors. When the Tatars saw the empty riverbank on the other side, they assumed the Russians were luring them into a trap and retreated south. Thus ended the standoff. This affair, known as the Stand on the Ugra, was for a long time seen as rather an embarrassing episode. Ivan's actions were taken as cowardly and vacillating. However, modern scholarship has shown that the records were heavily influenced by later political tracts that were aimed at discrediting Ivan's second wife, Sofia Paleologa, and establishing that Russia was liberated from the Tatars by divine intervention rather than human effort. The sequence of events, as it is described, seems improbable because the churchmen writing the chronicle reversed the order. It's more reasonable for us to assume that neither side wished to fight a destructive pitched battle. Kazimierz had shown no sign of joining. Ahmed had not been particularly aggressive. By now he knew that the rebel brothers had been reconciled with Ivan. After 2 weeks of stalemate, with the rivers frozen and the Lithuanians not showing on the horizon, the Khan decided to abandon his plans. Ivan withdrew his troops once he had seen that the Tatars had left, not before. According to the Kazan Chronicle, while Ivan and Ahmed faced off at the Ugra, Ivan sent one of his Tatar commanders, Udovliet, and Knyaz Vasily Nozdrovati down the river to attack Sarai, which had been left undefended. As soon as word reached Ahmed, he withdrew and returned to defend Sarai. We have no other evidence supporting this, but it would make perfect sense. We also know that at the same time, Mengli-Gire attacked Lithuania. The Lithuanian chronicles mention the attack and say that it was the reason why Kazimierz did not join Ahmed. There's no more detail, and Kazimierz had plenty of other stuff on his plate dealing with some rebellious Orthodox nobles. It is possible that Ivan had asked the Crimeans to attack Lithuania as a distraction. Ahmed's withdrawal was a disaster for him. After the weeks spent pillaging Lithuanian Ruthenian towns, the rumours were out that his men were laden with booty. Khan Ivak of the Siberian Khanate and 15,000 of his men crossed the Volga, joined the Nogai Horde, and began hunting down the Great Horde. Early in the morning on 6th of January 1481, they caught them asleep in their camp and killed Ahmed. For 5 days they plundered the Great Horde. A while later they sent an emissary to Ivan to give him the good news. Ivan sent the emissary back to Siberia with rich gifts. Had Ivan suggested the raid to Ivak? We don't know, but it would fit the general picture of events. Although the stand on the Ugra was a somewhat strange episode with an ambivalent reputation, it clearly marks the end of Moscow as a Tatar vassal. The Great Horde disintegrates after the death of Ahmed. Ivan and his successors will not even pretend to be subservient to any other Khan. No more tribute will be paid. No one will come running when the Khan's summons arrives. Although Ivan had not achieved a great military victory that would have given him a fine reputation, the moral victory was total. The Tatar army had come, and they had gone home without fighting because they did not believe that they could win. And although Ivan did not display any great heroism for the chroniclers to praise, he had put years of hard and skillful diplomatic work into creating the situation in which Ahmed found himself stranded and alone, work that the chroniclers did not always pay attention to. It's almost certain that the Crimeans attacked Lithuania as a result of their alliance, and it's quite likely that Ivan was behind Orthodox rebellions in Lithuania and the Siberian Tatars suddenly deciding to raid the Volga. Ivan had faced the Great Horde and Lithuania and had won, without losing any men and without suffering any harm to his territory. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.